Mahomed.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir. Listening to the Minister of Civil Service reminds me of the visit late Lee Kuan Yew, former Prime Minister of Singapore, when he visited Mauritius. A journalist asked him a question: how does he explain the success of Singapore? And he replied, the recipe is very simple. In every ministry in Singapore, the person that I put at the head of the ministry, I make sure that he or she is the most competent person in that ministry. And he did not stop there. He said, and the minister that I choose to put in that ministry, I make sure that he is more competent than the person that I put up in charge of that ministry. This is the simple recipe that Singapore has used, and it's food for thought for the Minister of Civil Service. Mr. Speaker, sir, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to intervene on the presentation of the budget exercise 2022-2023, titled "The Only True Prosperity is Shared Prosperity." An unusually long speech of nearly 2 hours from the Honourable Minister of Finance, if you compare it by local standards, and more so if you compare it with international standards. For example, in the UK this year, the Chancellor of Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, delivered the spring statement of 2022, the equivalent of the budget speech, in just 28 minutes, giving only the guiding principles. He did not consider it necessary to list down all the little drain and potholes projects to be implemented in every remote village in the United Kingdom. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, the budget contained a dog's dinner of measures: the good, the bad, and the very ugly. If you read the headlines of the newspapers, you will definitely come to the conclusion that this is a popular budget presenting giveaways to everyone in sight. But anyone who has just an ordinary level in economics must be concerned at the virtual absence of any fiscal responsibility or long-term thought for a country in dire debt. It is another of this government's Christmas tree budget. The Minister of Finance and his Eminence Grise consulted with everyone, then he just gave them all that they asked for, putting the country into deeper debt, full of pretty presents but based on utterly false promises about growth and tourist revenues. You have to go back to the 1980s to find a growth rate of 8% or more. And we have never had 1.4 million tourists, even in the best of times. What we have here is nothing but a false prospectus. If he were the director of a commercial company with this prospectus, under commercial law, he would deserve not a long thumping ovation from his friends, but he will be in big trouble. One might have expected to find in this voluminous package some forward thinking, but the whole collection of electoral bribes masquerading as goodies for the people lacks any serious planning. Throughout his overlong diatribe, there was scarcely a word about serious long-term planning. Perhaps he has just forgotten he holds the brief as minister responsible for economic planning and development. He has given away so much when the national coffers are empty and we are up to our necks in debt repayment. Did he mention that? No. And it is not his money he's giving away. It is the money not just of current taxpayers today, but that of our children and our children's children. What is the long-term planning? The long-term prospect for this country are before us in a great abscess of debt, even after plundering the carefully secured reserves of the Bank of Mauritius. As a matter of fact, I've said it before, this malaise of lack of planning in the country started with the first Minister of Finance of the MSM in 2015, Vishnu Lakshmi Naidu, who got rid of the program-based budgeting that the Labour Party-led government had initiated in 2005 and which was functioning very well by 2014. But what to do? There has been so much harm done to the essential institutions since 2014, and the demise of the planning is just one act of the ugly acts of this regime. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, as an elected member in the capital city of Port Louis, I have observed the reaction of the Minister of Local Government just after reading of the budget speech. I think he was the first one to leave his seat and to cross over to congratulate the Minister of Finance. He went and shook his hand, I saw. I believe the abolition of municipal taxes has to do with this bout of excitement. An electoral promise which is being implemented with a delay of 2.5 years, as the House will recall, that it was in the electoral manifesto of both the MSM and the Labour Party-led alliance. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, in congratulating the Minister of Finance, I hope that the Minister of Local Government, excited as he was on Budget Day, has been able to convince the Minister of Finance to compensate the financial shortfall so as not to lead to falling level of service being provided by the municipal councils. We shall be very watchful over this in the interest of the citizens, as you will recall how since 2019 to date, members of the opposition have constantly been bringing to the House during parliamentary questions and adjournment time so many problems concerning faulty streetlights, household waste not being collected on time, the dangerous state of many streets, inundation from flooding, and rampant neglect of other public amenities. As a reminder, the last time the Municipal Council of Port Louis distributed waste bins to the citizens of Port Louis, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, was during the days of the Labour Party, the same government that spearheaded a program for Maurice Iljurab. And yet, the budget speech at paragraph 2013 to 2016 talks about the cleaning of Mauritius through a national environment cleaning agency that has been set up under the Prime Minister's office to develop in our national cleaning strategy, and that a sum of 1 billion rupees is being allocated. Please do the simple things first and distribute bins to the citizen to start with, and then we talk about the big strategies later. The second planning issue is that of the rise in pension of 1,000 rupees to 2,000 rupees, which is overdue, because our pensioners have not had a compensation since 2020, and meanwhile the cost of living has increased by so much. But what is worrisome about this is that it is being taken prematurely from the CSG. This comes with two repercussions. Firstly, the CSG might have to be increased in the future, and secondly, when the pension payment will eventually reach 13,500 rupees, our children and grandchildren will have to shoulder this very heavy burden. For some years now, the IMF has declared our pensions policy unsustainable. Their warnings have fallen on deaf ears, and step by step, we find this government dishing out goodies when the cupboard is bare and just kicking the hugely accumulating can down of public debt down the road. Hanging an increasing burden of debt round the necks of every citizen was creating the illusion that we are riding the crest of prosperity. A false illusion, a false prospectus. I shall now move to some specific sectors, the multi-billion-dollar rupees ones, which I've been following here in Parliament, and the first one is social housing. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I watched the NBC News of last Friday, more specifically on la cérémonie de remise des clés of housing units at Martaba. I was shocked with what I heard and saw on TV, and that is the Honorable Obigadu, who is not here, in the presence of the Indian High Commissioner, delivering a most political speech. He went on to mention figures of the number of housing units built by the Labour Party over the mandates 2005 to 2010, and to 2010, 2014, at a time of rejoice when families have come to take possession of their housing keys at long last. And as a matter of fact, the MBC, out of the speech of the Honorable Abigadu, made a PowerPoint presentation which was broadcast on TV. Here it is. I took a photo of this. Ancien gouvernement, 2006 à 2010, premier mandat, 1900 maisons construites. 2011 à 2014, deuxième mandat, 550 maisons construites. People come to take their keys and you are doing this kind of speech in front of the ambassador of India. But since we are at it, let me ask through you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, why did the Honorable Obigadu start with 2005? Why not before? And social housing, is it limited to units delivered by the NSDC only? The answer is no. The Assembly, and indeed the people, especially the senior citizens, will recall that it was the Labour Party, led by Sir Siu Sagar Ramgoolam, that started with the construction of social housing units in Mauritius through the Central Housing Authority after Cyclone Carol, being given that after the passage of that cyclone, many families lost their homes. By the way, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, since we are talking about the MBC and Sir Siu Sagar Ramgoolam, did you notice how the MBC has reverted back to calling SSR Botanical Garden as Jardin des Pamplemousses and SSR International Airport as l'Aéroport de Présence? Airbrushing the father of our nation out of the picture, a technique commonly placed under Marshal Stalin of the USSR. Anyway, coming back to social housing, you know how many families benefited of a CHA housing unit, Mr. Speaker, sir? 19,500 families, at a time when much less families were living in Mauritius. So those days, 19,500 families must have represented at least 10% of the household in those early days. And the greatest democratization to home ownership, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, did not stop here. During the course of time, the CHA housing units were sold to the families for a low price. And in 2005, under the Prime Ministership of Dr. Navin Ramgoolam, the state land onto which these same housing units stand and other leases granted for social housing, including NSDC complexes, were sold to the families at 2,000 rupees per lot. A plot of land at 2,000 rupees, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir. Following an amendment that was brought to the State Land Act. I was at the Ministry of Housing at the material time, and I know it very well. As a matter of fact, the sale of the plots in the region of Port Louis, Obigadu is not here, since the MSM has come to power, and I even put a parliamentary question on this, on the state land in my constituency, has since sale of state land in Port Louis has ceased, notwithstanding the fact that people's dossiers are at the notary's office. I fail to understand why, and I hope someday he will provide it with an explanation. Furthermore, I can understand in Pageometric there was a decision, but in Port Louis, Honorable Ganu, you know the dossier well. Why in Port Louis people's dossiers are stuck at the notary's office for years now and they don't get their contracts? Furthermore, in comparing the figures from 2005 to 2014 and 2014 onwards, I hope the Minister of Housing has factored in the fact that the Labour Party-led government has, before the general elections of 2014, I was there for some time at the NSDC as managing director, initiated the process for housing at Petit Belair, Melrose, Koirati, Notre-Dame, Bassin, Nehru-Nagle in Flac, Chebel-A, Camp du Masque, Henrietta, Goodlands, Saint-Julien d'Otman, Madame Azor, Souillac and Morgou, and that these sites had actually reached different stages in the implementation process, and they were either at a stage where the contracts for construction were already awarded, some were at evaluation of bid stage, for some, their contract for soil investigation were already awarded, And some even had reached the first step of financial clearances being sought at the Ministry of Finance. That was the progress at the end of 2014. And these housing units that were initiated by the government, Labour Party-led government, were continued. And then, like my colleague is saying, they could prove afterwards. And they put it as their belong. This is what it is all about. On a different note, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, but since and still in the domain of social housing, did you know that the grant of 10,000 units for casting of roof slab is also part of the social housing program? And I do recall, when I was MD of the NSDC, a cumulative total of around 60,000 units of also household had already benefited from this grant at the material time. Furthermore, the figure must be more now. But furthermore, I must emphasize that the last time the grant amount was revised, 200,000 rupees, was during budget exercise of 2018. Since then, the official construction price index of Statistics Mauritius has increased by 26% from March 2018 to March 2022. But I personally think that this is the higher figure. Construction has increased by much more. So, the 100,000 rupees grant today is not sufficient. And I was hoping that the Minister of Housing would have succeeded in lobbying to raise this amount, as is currently expected by the population. 100,000 rupees in 2018 for construction today, this amount is, you cannot compare. It's too low. Let me now move with some further issues on social housing. The first one has to do with the now overzealous program for 12,000 units, touted once upon a time to cost 12 billion rupees. How much is the estimated cost today, when we all know that it costs at least 2 million rupees to build an apartment of 3 rooms, without the provisions of passenger lifts? The budget speech is silent on this. The project value, according to me, for 12,000 housing units must be at least 24 billion rupees. By the way, I would advise limiting the number of floors for the flat blocks to a maximum of 4, so as to avoid the need for the provision of lifts in the social housing unit, because le bon fonctionnement des syndics a été un casse-tête perpétuel et les ascenseurs resteront en panne pendant longtemps. Secondly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, the implementation of this project that was first announced 2 years ago during budget exercise 2020-21 is becoming more and more like La Rivière des Anguilles Dam. Every year you hear about it, but you don't see it. Gars sont, mais pas gars images. 4 billion rupees was the forecasted expenditure in the last financial year, but it was revised to 100 million rupees. Underperformance indeed. But where did that 100 million rupees go? To build housing units? The answer is no. The 100 million rupees has been used to fund the lavish expenditure of the new social living development, the special purpose vehicle that has been set up to implement this project since its creation in 2019. To start with, there has been recruitment of the boys and girls with very fat pay packages and expensive officers and luxurious cars. A chairman, 1 group CEO, 2 chief operations officers, 5 directors, 1 general manager for project department, 1 group project manager, to name but a few. The NSLD is now occupying very luxurious offices at NPF building of Rosehill at 42 rupees per meter square, and at the Cyber City for even higher, and for no genuine reason progressively leaving the office at Royal Complex in Rosehill, costing a mere 25 rupees per meter square. NSDC has been based at the Royal Complex for 23 years now. Never had a complaint on behalf of the public, as well as clients or staff, that the place is not appropriate. One thing about this company, the NSLD, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, and the people managing it with their spendthrift attitude, they are spending money of the taxpayers as if there is no tomorrow. But then, it seems to be a common feature of this government head-bent on stoking inflation, increasing the poverty of the poorest, while swanning around in guzzling limousines and working in deluxe offices the country can't afford. Talking about throwing money down the drain, let me update the House of an outstanding issue that I had raised in parliamentary question of 7 December 2021, when I mentioned in the House that there was a strange happening which I never encountered as managing director of the NSGC, and this is the case of a dispute which went for arbitration between NSGC and Super Construction Limited. In the meantime, the latter, Super Construction, has won the arbitration, and the NSGC is now compelled to pay 41 million rupees in compensation when it was the first to strike with a report to the police it had filed for wrongdoings by the contractor, bearing OB number 6817/2021, which I had even given to the Minister in Parliament. And he told me, you have something to say, to go to the ICAC. That was his attitude. And if you think this stops here, you're wrong, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir. Super Construction has filed another case against the NSGC for 103 million rupees, and due to the amateurish setup at the NSGC and the NSLD, I see the Minister of Housing is back, with the most incompetent chairman and CEO, I'm afraid they can lose this case as well. Le domaine du logement social est un bateau sans gouvernail, Monsieur le Président. Let me now move to public infrastructure, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir. I was reading what Mr. Jean-Claude Delestrac wrote in l'Express of 15 May 2022. I quote, « J'ai été ahuri d'entendre un ministre de la République pour répondre aux opposants de la construction d'une route dans une région écologiquement sensible, arguer que les habitants des circonscriptions 5 à 12 avaient bien droit, eux aussi, à leur autoroute. Bientôt, un mur, peut-être, il existe déjà dans les têtes. » End of quotation. I subsequently went and looked for which minister he was referring to. And I was dumbfounded to note that it was the Honorable Hari Ram during a press conference at MSM headquarters, following a parliamentary question I had asked about the M4 highway, that same highway that started in Forbach and which ends up in Plaine-Maillan, passing through the Vallée de Ferney. Now, what did the minister really mean? Or was it just another slip of the tongue, like the off an omelette blunder? I wonder. Mr. Speaker, sir, I subsequently explained the rationale of my asking the question. I failed to understand what has, first of all, I tried to understand the rationale. First of all, what has constituency number 5 and 8 got to do with the M4 highway? We start in Forbach, right down to Plaine-Maillan. So his meaning was something else. But then, that's him. Yeah, that's it, that's it. You know, there is a famous Sanskrit saying, and it stands as follows. Vinash kale viparit buddhi. You understand?
Translate.
Made famous in Mauritius by the Honorable Arvind Boulel.
Translate.
Quand la fin costait, l'esprit s'avérait. Everything, the reasoning is... Anyway, regarding the construction of the road, regarding the construction of the link roads, bypasses and flyovers to the tune of billions to the road development, to the road decongestion program, I also believe that it's good to have equity in the distribution of infrastructure across the country, unlike what Honorable Hari Ram is saying, and that construction creates more economic activity. But Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I know there is a discrepancy in this discourse at this moment. Honorable Minister of Infrastructure himself in press conference on Saturday last has stated that we need to build more roads because there are more vehicles now in Mauritius. A fundamental question is, will expanding highways and building more roads actually make traffic better or worse? Mr. Speaker, sir, at the time the government is investing massively in the Metro Express project, There is nothing in the budget that encourages people to leave their cars at home and to travel by the metro, which has lost more than 500 billion rupees from what I understand. Second factor to consider in terms of road repairs cost, pollution and congestion. Thirdly, I here highlight the theory of induced demand. Building more roads and adding more lanes give the appearance of speeding up traffic. But by encouraging sprawl, it spreads out stores, houses and jobs, providing more reasons to drive more, thus expanding many people's commutes. It also adds more capacity, which is almost immediately filled up with more cars. Research by Kent Heimel of California State University of Northridge found that adding 1% more road capacity produces the exact same increase in the amount of vehicle miles traveled. There is another report from Transportation for America titled The Congestion Con. It's all a lie, attesting to that. I would strongly recommend the Minister of Public Infrastructure to read it. And then one should not forget that building more roads is environmentally destructive. Not only for the M4, as it passes to the Vallée de Ferney, but anywhere, and road projects, if not planned properly, can cause more flooding. Which brings me to the domain of construction of drain by NDU. Through COVID-19 project fund, 36 billion rupees was earmarked for spending last year, but only 800 million was actually spent. And then there is this Drain Infrastructure Construction Limited, which actually has as mandate the fast tracking of implementation of the National Debt Management Program, which funds to the tune of 10.4 billion rupees according to a cabinet decision of 22 October 2021. Sounds good, even if you can't afford it, the first false illusion of prosperity. I want to emphasize here today in this House that following an article of L'Express of 10 May 2022, and in which I had intervened, entitled Le premier contrat pour 79 millions alloué sans transparence, the officer in charge of the Drain Infrastructure Construction Limited, Mr. Harideo Bola, was sacked. The question is, why was Mr. Bola immediately sacked? Who is the officer in charge of that department today? And who is the chairman of that department? Excuse me.
Please, go ahead.
There is something very weird with this company, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir. The House will recall that the Honourable Minister of Public Infrastructure, during parliamentary question B1012 earlier this year, was unable to reply to my additional question regarding the modus operandi of this company. He said, we, meaning his ministry, has received a decision from Cabinet to incorporate. That is being worked upon, et en temps et lieu, on va répondre. Meanwhile, paragraph 168 of last week's budget states that an interministerial committee chaired by the Prime Minister will oversee the streamlining of licenses and permits in the construction sector. So this could be the reason why he was unable to reply, because decisions are being taken elsewhere and he was just at the receiving end to implement. In this regard, transparency and contract allocation by this company, I have set another parliamentary question for the next sitting. I would now move to environment and sustainable development domains, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir. I was shocked to hear from paragraph 27 of the Minister of Finance speech that we rely on imports for more than 75% of our food requirements. This is much more than what it was in 2014, when you factor in that the number of tourists have considerably reduced in the country today. I have listened to the Honourable Minister of Agri-Industry in press conference last Saturday that we will never reach 100% because we will always import rice and wheat. Fair enough. But who is asking for 100%? For 7 years, the MSM has been in power, food import has increased substantially. Yet another evidence-based failure. The House will recall that during the Labour Party years, there was locally produced rice in Mauritius by Vita Rice. Rice with ultra-low glycemic index, and the country was planning to reduce its dependency on rice imports by 25%. So much for this government's long-term stewardship. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, at paragraph 172, regarding holders of residence permits, will be given to the opportunity to buy property of a minimum of USD 250,000 outside the existing schemes upon paying 10% contribution to the National Solidarity Levy, makes me think of at least two drawbacks with this. Firstly, landowners, the big ones, will be further encouraged to go for property development rather than food security. Secondly, local home buyers will be priced out of the market. This situation reminds me of former US President Harry Truman, about him always wanted to have a one-handed economist, because his economists were always telling him that on the one hand there is this, and on the other hand there is that, and that the consequence of this is that he had only one mandate as US President. I now rapidly move to renewable energy. Paragraph 202 states that, no, I was listening earlier, sorry, to the Minister of Public Utilities, Honorable Jolet Jonga, in respect of the production of renewable energy by bagasse. He said that the biomass framework is under preparation. I think he is not aware. A few hours earlier, the Minister of Agro-Industry, Mr. Manish Gobin, stated that the biomass framework has been produced and has been submitted to his office some 2 to 3 weeks back. So, I wish to quote the Honorable Ariane Navarre-Marie, je vais mettre un lot de cette marchi. Has it been produced, the biomass framework? Because the Honorable Lejonga said it is being produced. It is being prepared. So anyway, paragraph 202 states that Metro Express will implement photovoltaic farms to cater for its electricity needs at Richelieu and Eben. Now, I have always believed that Metro Express should produce its own electricity. During the days of the Honorable Ganu's predecessor, Mr. Buddha, the House will recall that I had put a question, PQ B492, on 3rd July 2018. I had asked him whether in regard to the Metro Express project, he will state inter alia if the generation of electricity from photovoltaic sources from roof of the stations or train or trams is being envisaged, and if not, why not? 4 years, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir. This is how long it took the government to come up with a budgetary measure on this. And God knows how long it will take to implement this. And where are the long-term plans for similar schemes for the roofs of schools, hospitals, and other government buildings? Not to mention the long waiting list of those who want to have some solar-generated electricity on their own roofs. We need some joined-up government today to build on the wealth of sunshine for tomorrow. Regarding the measures to incite the purchase of electric vehicles, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I hope that it will come with measures to entice people to charge their cars through renewable sources or at off-peak hours. Because if they have to use the grid, otherwise CB will be in deep trouble. Managing the peak demand, which is the real problem today. The percentage of renewable energy, instead of increasing, is actually decreasing. From 22.3% in 2020 to 19.83% in 2021. And yet the Minister of Energy says that he is very confident. Now, no mention has been made in the budget from switching from public officers to go for electric vehicles. And it is a real pity that the budget speech does not say anything about the treatment to be dispensed to the people who are on synthetic drugs. In 2014, when Labour Party was left office, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, do you know how many cases of synthetic drug patients were admitted to Brownsacre Hospital? This is the figures of the MBC. Only 5 in 2013. In 2019, MBC figures 1,099. This is 2019. How much is it today? Is it 2,000? Is it 3,000? Is it 4,000? We don't know. And yet, the Minister of Finance has taken the trouble to mention, like I said initially, all the drains he will be constructing, but not a single word for treatment to people who are on synthetic drugs. This is most scandalous. And since we are talking about the youth, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, let me mention something that concerns my constituency. 4 minutes, thank you. About the historical football pitch at Saint-Denis called Stade Bayrajak, the ex-YMCA stadium. A football ground that has seen emerging some of the best footballers of Mauritius. The pitch is being converted to horse stables, making Saint-Denis lose its green cachet. And not to mention the foul smell that is going to be generated from from there, knowing that there are nearby secondary school and even primary school, and the wedding halls, Gymkhana and Tahir Bagh, Honorable Asnu knows the place well, and will also be a serious nuisance to people, thousands of people who go there for their leisure and also for their regular exercises. No one knows what is the real plan that People Turf PLC has for this plot of land. So, and I wonder whether the Municipal Council of Port Louis, whether the Ministry of Housing and Lands or the Ministry of Environment has granted EIA license on this. So as Minister of Local Government, I would make a request to the Honorable Osnu to look into this, because no one knows what is being built there at the end of the day. We know horse stables are being built, but what else, we don't know. Right. To conclude, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I wish to add that the aim of any responsible budget is to give a fiscal, economic planning and development path to the country for the future. Over several budgets now, we see that this is missing, and this has led to the underperformance of Mauritius, which has been aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the Ukraine-Russia war. All stakeholders were looking for a sense of direction, and we have had a catalogue of electoral bribes disguised as social measures. The younger generation are once again left behind by this government and are still in the dark as to what the future holds for them. Their future is to pick up the bills for this government's fiscal incompetence. This false prospectus is a crime that will sadly not put its perpetrators in prison, but the whole country in the chains of rising inflation and the abyss of continuing massive debt. For all the goodies people think they have been handed out, the stark reality is the whole country is condemned by this budget to face a bad and ugly future. There has been no creation of new economic pillars to generate wealth for the country and the population. The ugliest part of this criminal budget is that we all face the dire consequences of financial incompetence under the shadow of a great illusion that we are being enriched. I thank you for your attention at these early hours of the morning.